The woman who cleaned our house every week left a note saying, "Check your daughter's bedroom for cameras. I'm so sorry. I'm leaving the state." I found the note tucked inside our mail slot when I got home from work on a Friday evening. The handwriting was shaky, rushed, nothing like the careful block letters Maria usually used on her weekly cleaning checklists. My wife Claire was still at her hospital shift, and my daughter Sophia was at soccer practice. The house was empty and quiet as I stood in our entryway reading those words over and over, trying to make them mean something other than what they clearly said. Maria had cleaned our house every Wednesday for 3 years. She was punctual, thorough, trustworthy. We'd given her a key after the first month. She knew where we kept everything, had access to every room, every drawer, every closet. The note was dated today, with a timestamp of 1:30 p.m., about 4 hours ago. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called Maria's number. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Same result. The voicemail greeting was her voice, professional and warm, asking callers to leave a message. I didn't leave one because I didn't know what to say. I went upstairs to Sophia's bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. The room looked exactly as it always did after Maria cleaned. Bed made with the purple comforter Sophia loved, stuffed animals arranged neatly on the window seat, desk organized with homework folders and art supplies. Everything normal. I started checking the obvious places first. The smoke detector mounted on the ceiling near her closet. I pulled a chair over and carefully unscrewed the cover. Inside was just the standard battery and sensor mechanism. I checked the digital alarm clock on her nightstand, turning it over to examine the back panel. Nothing unusual. The decorative picture frames on her dresser. The small bookshelf speakers we'd bought her for listening to music. The outlet covers. I was pulling apart her room systematically and finding nothing, which somehow made everything worse. If Maria was wrong, if this was some kind of mistake or paranoid delusion, why would she run? Why leave a note instead of calling? Why apologize? I checked the air vent cover, removing the screws with a Phillips head from Sophia's desk drawer. Behind the grate was just ductwork and dust. I was about to give up when I noticed the stuffed unicorn on her bed, the large one she'd gotten for her 10th birthday 2 years ago. It sat propped against her pillows, its glassy eyes pointed toward the center of the room. Something about those eyes made me pause. I picked up the unicorn and examined it closely. The eyes were black plastic with a slight sheen, standard for stuffed animals. But when I held it at a certain angle, I could see a tiny pinhole in the center of the right eye's pupil. My stomach dropped. I turned the unicorn over and found a small seam in the back that had been carefully restitched with thread that almost matched, but not quite. The stitching was professional, nearly invisible, but once I looked for it, I could see where the original seam had been opened and closed. My hands trembled as I carefully pulled the stitches apart and reached inside the stuffing. The camera was small, maybe the size of a thumb drive, with a lens that aligned perfectly with the eye hole. It was connected to a battery pack and what looked like a wireless transmitter, all nestled in a hollow space carved out of the stuffing. The device was still warm, which meant it was active and recording. I pulled everything out and set it on Sophia's desk, staring at this thing that had been watching my daughter sleep, change clothes, do homework, live her private life in what should have been her safe space. I felt physically sick. Who had put this here? How long had it been there? What had they seen? What had they recorded? The unicorn had been a gift from Claire's brother, my brother-in-law Dennis. He'd brought it over personally on Sophia's birthday, making a big show of picking out the biggest, most expensive stuffed animal at the toy store. Sophia had loved it immediately. We'd all thought it was sweet. I thought about Dennis in our house, in Sophia's room, installing this camera while we ate cake downstairs. I called Claire at the hospital, and she answered on the third ring, sounding distracted and tired from her emergency room shift. I told her she needed to come home immediately, that it was an emergency about Sophia. Claire's voice shifted instantly to sharp focus, asking what happened and if Sophia was hurt. I said Sophia was fine physically, but that something serious had happened at the house, and I needed her home now. She said she'd leave in 10 minutes and be home in 20. I hung up and called Sophia next. She was at soccer practice for another 45 minutes. I told her I'd pick her up early and to wait for me in the parking lot with her coach. Sophia asked why, and I said we had a family situation to deal with. My 12-year-old daughter asked if Grandma was okay, if something bad had happened, her voice small and scared. I told her everyone was fine and I'd explain when I got there. I grabbed my keys and the camera equipment, sealing everything in a plastic bag. I picked up Sophia from the soccer field 20 minutes later. She climbed into the car with her gear bag, still wearing her practice clothes, her face worried. The drive home was quiet because I didn't know how to start this conversation without terrifying her. Sophia asked again what was wrong, and I said Mom was meeting us at home, and we'd all talk together. She pushed her hair behind her ears, a nervous gesture she'd had since she was little, and stared out the window. When we pulled into our driveway, Claire's car was already there. She was standing in the doorway waiting for us, still in her scrubs, her face tight with controlled concern. I ushered Sophia inside, and Claire immediately pulled her into a hug, asking if she was okay. Sophia said she was confused and wanted to know what was happening. I told them both to sit down in the living room. The plastic bag with the camera equipment was sitting on the coffee table. Claire saw it and looked at me with questions in her eyes. I explained everything as calmly as I could manage. Maria's note, the search of Sophia's room, finding the camera hidden in the unicorn. Sophia's face went pale, then red, then crumpled as she started crying. Claire pulled her close, her own face white with shock and fury. Sophia was asking who would do this and why, her voice breaking, and Claire was saying we didn't know yet, but we'd find out. I showed them the camera equipment still sealed in the bag, explained that I'd touched it before I'd thought about evidence and fingerprints, but that we needed to call the police immediately. Claire nodded, holding Sophia tight while our daughter sobbed into her shoulder. I dialed 911 and reported that we'd found surveillance equipment hidden in our child's bedroom, that we believed our daughter had been illegally recorded in her private space. The dispatcher took our address and said officers would be there within 15 minutes. The 2 patrol officers who arrived were professionals and kind. Officer Denise Kwan and Officer Ahmad Patel listened to our explanation, examined the camera equipment I'd removed from the unicorn, and took detailed notes. Officer Kwan asked careful questions about who had access to our house, how long we'd had the stuffed animal, and when we'd last seen Maria. I explained that Maria was our housekeeper, had been for 3 years, had a key to our house, and had left the note warning us about cameras. Officer Patel asked if Maria had mentioned any suspicions before today, and I said no, never. He asked if we'd noticed anything unusual about our daughter's behavior, or if she'd mentioned anyone watching her or making her uncomfortable. Sophia shook her head, saying she'd never noticed anything wrong. Officer Kwan photographed the camera equipment and bagged it as evidence. She explained they'd need to contact detectives who specialized in these cases, that this was likely part of a larger investigation into hidden camera crimes. Detective Lisa Yang arrived 90 minutes later with a digital forensics specialist named Trevor Quinn. Detective Yang was in her 40s with sharp eyes that took in every detail of our living room. She sat down with us and asked us to walk through the timeline again from the beginning. I repeated everything about finding Maria's note, searching Sophia's room, discovering the camera. Detective Yang asked to see Sophia's room, and we all went upstairs. She examined the unicorn, the placement of the bed, the angles the camera would have captured. Trevor Quinn took measurements and photographs, documenting everything methodically. Detective Yang asked Sophia gentle questions about whether she'd noticed the unicorn's eyes looking different, if she'd felt watched, if anyone besides family had been in her room recently. Sophia answered quietly, her voice small and traumatized, saying she'd never noticed anything unusual. Her room had felt safe until today. Now it felt violated. Back downstairs, Detective Yang explained that these types of hidden camera cases were becoming more common, often connected to networks of people who traded illegal recordings. The camera I'd found was a sophisticated device capable of streaming video wirelessly to external servers, meaning someone had been watching in real time and potentially recording for later viewing or distribution. The battery pack suggested it had been installed recently, within the past month, because the batteries would need regular replacement. She asked again about Dennis, my brother-in-law who'd given the unicorn as a gift. I told her Dennis was Claire's older brother, that he worked in IT at a tech company downtown, that he visited regularly for family dinners and holidays. Claire added that Dennis had always been good to Sophia, had been her favorite uncle, had never given them any reason to be concerned. Detective Yang wrote everything down and said they'd need to speak with Dennis and Maria both, and that we should avoid contact with either of them until the investigation was complete. Detective Yang asked if there were other gifts or items in the house that had come from Dennis or anyone else we didn't completely trust. Claire and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing, and simultaneously said his name. The smart speaker Dennis had given us last Christmas, the digital photo frame he'd given Claire for her birthday, the tablet he'd given Sophia for her 11th birthday. All electronics, all gifts from Dennis, all items that had seemed generous and thoughtful at the time. Detective Yang's expression darkened. She called Trevor Quinn back into the room and asked him to check those devices. Trevor spent the next hour examining our electronics with tools from his kit. The smart speaker was clean. The digital photo frame had a small camera modification that shouldn't have been there. The tablet had monitoring software installed that logged every app Sophia used, every website she visited, every photo she took, and transmitted that data to a remote server. Trevor explained this in clinical terms, while Claire held Sophia and I felt rage building in my chest hot enough to blur my vision. Detective Yang said this was clearly a pattern of surveillance and that Dennis was now the primary suspect. She asked if Dennis had a history with law enforcement, any prior arrests or restraining orders. We said no, that Dennis had always seemed normal, maybe a bit awkward socially but harmless. We'd trusted him completely. He was family. Detective Yang said predators often used familial trust as cover, that being someone's brother or uncle, provided access and credibility that outsiders didn't have. She asked if we knew Dennis's address and his work schedule. Claire gave her the information, her voice hollow with shock. I asked what happened next, and Detective Yang said they'd obtain warrants to search Dennis's home and seize his electronic devices, that they'd also try to locate Maria, since she clearly had information about what was happening. She warned us that investigations like this took time, but that the evidence we'd found was enough to start building a criminal case immediately. After the police left, we sat in our living room in stunned silence. Sophia had cried herself into exhaustion and fallen asleep on the couch with her head in Claire's lap. Claire stroked our daughter's hair with mechanical gentleness while staring at nothing. I kept replaying every interaction with Dennis, every family dinner and holiday gathering, trying to see the signs I'd missed. He'd always paid attention to Sophia, asked about her school and friends and hobbies, taken interest in her life. We'd thought he was being a good uncle. Now every memory was contaminated, reframed as a predator gathering intelligence. Claire finally spoke, her voice flat and broken, saying she'd invited him into our home, had trusted him with our daughter, had thought he was family. I told her this wasn't her fault, that predators were skilled at deception, that we'd both been fooled. Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face, saying she should have protected Sophia better. We didn't sleep that night. I stayed up researching hidden camera laws, reading about other families who'd discovered surveillance in their homes, trying to understand how common this was and whether we'd ever feel safe again. The statistics were horrifying. Thousands of hidden camera cases every year. Predators using increasingly sophisticated technology to violate privacy. Networks of people trading and selling footage. Most victims never knowing they'd been recorded. I thought about Maria's note, her apology, her flight. She'd known and had stayed silent for some period of time before finally warning us and running. How long had she known? Had she seen Dennis installing cameras? Had Dennis threatened her or paid her to stay quiet? Or had she discovered the surveillance accidentally and panicked? Detective Yang had said they'd track Maria down, but I wondered if we'd ever get those answers, or if Maria had disappeared completely. The next morning, Detective Yang called to say they'd executed a search warrant on Dennis's apartment. What they'd found was worse than we'd imagined. Dennis had an entire room set up as a surveillance station with multiple monitors displaying live feeds from hidden cameras. They'd counted feeds from 17 different locations, including our house, the homes of Dennis's friends and neighbors, the apartment of his ex-girlfriend, and the locker room at his gym. His computer contained thousands of hours of recorded video organized in folders by location and victim name. Sophia's folder had hundreds of files spanning back 6 months, far longer than the battery life of the camera I'd found, which meant Dennis had been replacing batteries and maintaining the equipment during his regular visits to our house. Detective Yang's voice was professional, but I could hear the disgust underneath as she described finding files that showed Dennis had been recording Sophia changing clothes, sleeping, doing private things in her room that no one should have witnessed. Dennis was arrested at his workplace that morning without incident. He didn't resist or try to flee. According to Detective Yang, he'd simply put his hands up and said he wanted a lawyer. They'd seized his work computer too, finding similar surveillance software and file folders, suggesting he'd been using his IT position at the company to install monitoring software on employee computers and phones. The scope of his criminal activity was massive, touching dozens of victims across multiple states. Dennis had been running what amounted to a surveillance empire, trading footage with other predators online, selling custom recordings to buyers who requested specific targets. The digital forensics team estimated they'd need months to fully catalog the evidence and identify all the victims. Detective Yang said we should prepare for this to be a long and difficult process, and that Sophia would likely need extensive therapy to process what had happened to her. Claire called her parents that afternoon to tell them what Dennis had done. The conversation was short and brutal. Her mother cried and kept saying she didn't believe it, that there must be a mistake, that Dennis wouldn't do something like this. Her father was silent for a long time before saying he wanted to talk to Dennis himself, to hear his side of the story. Claire told them there was no other side, that police had found thousands of recordings, including footage of their granddaughter being violated in her own bedroom. Her mother hung up. Her father said they needed time to process this. Claire sat at our kitchen table after the call and put her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. Her family was fracturing under the weight of what Dennis had done, and I couldn't protect her from that pain any more than I'd been able to protect Sophia from her uncle's surveillance. Maria's role in the situation remained unclear until Detective Yang called 3 days later saying they'd located her in Nevada. Maria had driven straight to her sister's house in Las Vegas and had been prepared to disappear completely when police tracked her down. During her interview, Maria explained that she'd discovered the camera in Sophia's unicorn accidentally 2 weeks ago while dusting. She'd recognized it because her ex-boyfriend had hidden similar cameras in her own apartment years ago during an abusive relationship. She'd confronted Dennis about it when he'd shown up at our house during one of her cleaning days, claiming he'd forgotten his jacket. Dennis had admitted what he was doing and had threatened Maria, saying if she told anyone, he'd report her to immigration authorities claiming she'd stolen from us. Maria had been terrified because her work visa had expired 6 months ago, and she'd been living in the country illegally while waiting for renewal paperwork. She'd stayed silent for 2 weeks, consumed by guilt and fear, until she couldn't live with herself anymore. The note had been her compromise, warning us while protecting herself by leaving the state. Detective Yang said Maria was cooperating fully with the investigation and had provided testimony about Dennis's threats and admissions. Maria had also identified another housekeeper in the area who'd had similar encounters with Dennis, a woman who cleaned for Dennis's ex-girlfriend and had found cameras that Dennis had installed there. The second housekeeper had also stayed silent out of fear, and her testimony was helping build a conspiracy case against Dennis, showing a pattern of intimidation and witness tampering. I asked if Maria would face deportation, and Detective Yang said that was above her jurisdiction, but that prosecutors often provided cooperation visas for witnesses in major criminal cases. she'd pass along our support for Maria receiving immunity in exchange for her testimony. I thanked her and meant it. Maria had ultimately done the right thing, even though it had cost her everything she'd built in this country. Her note had saved Sophia from additional months or years of surveillance before we'd accidentally discovered it some other way or never discovered it at all. The criminal case against Dennis moved forward slowly but steadily. His attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors refused anything less than maximum sentences on all counts. They'd identified 43 separate victims from Dennis's recordings, including 16 minors. The charges included child exploitation, illegal surveillance, distribution of illegal recordings, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. Dennis was held without bail because prosecutors successfully argued he was a flight risk and a danger to the community. Claire's parents hired a lawyer for Dennis despite our protests. They still couldn't fully accept what their son had done, clinging to the idea that this was somehow a misunderstanding or that Dennis had been hacked by someone else who'd planted evidence. Their denial was painful to watch, and it created a permanent rift in Claire's family. Her parents stopped calling and didn't visit. When Claire tried to reach out, conversations were stilted and ended quickly. They blamed her for not defending Dennis, for believing police over her own brother. Sophia started trauma therapy with a specialist who worked with child exploitation victims. The therapist, Dr. Nina Okafor, was patient and experienced, helping Sophia process not just what had happened, but also the betrayal of trust from someone she'd loved. Sophia struggled with nightmares and anxiety. She didn't want to sleep in her room anymore, and we converted our guest room into a new bedroom for her with furniture and decorations she picked out herself, nothing that had been gifts from anyone. She became hyper-vigilant about electronics, checking devices for hidden cameras, asking us constantly if we were sure something was safe. Dr. Okafor said this was normal trauma response, and that with time and support, Sophia would regain her sense of safety. But the timeline for healing was years, not months. Some aspects of what Dennis had stolen from Sophia could never be fully recovered. That loss of innocence, that violation of the sanctuary her bedroom should have been, those were permanent damages. The preliminary hearing happened 4 months after Dennis's arrest. Claire and I attended, sitting in the courtroom while prosecutors presented evidence to establish probable cause for trial. We watched detectives testify about the search warrant execution, describing the surveillance station in Dennis's apartment and the thousands of recordings they'd found. We watched Trevor Quinn explain the technical aspects of the hidden cameras and monitoring software. We watched Maria testify via video conference from Nevada, describing how she'd discovered the camera and how Dennis had threatened her. And we watched Dennis sitting at the defense table in his jail jumpsuit, looking thinner and older than he had at family dinners, showing no emotion as victim after victim was described. The judge ruled that prosecution had established sufficient evidence and scheduled the trial for 8 months out. During discovery, Dennis's attorney tried to suppress evidence, claiming the search warrant had been improperly obtained. The motion was denied. They tried to exclude Maria's testimony, claiming her illegal immigration status made her an unreliable witness. That motion was also denied. They tried to negotiate again for a plea deal, and again prosecutors refused anything that didn't include life imprisonment. Dennis's attorney had no good options because the evidence was overwhelming and damning. The recordings existed, the cameras had been found, the victims were identified. There was no plausible defense beyond claiming Dennis had been hacked or framed, and the forensic evidence didn't support those theories. Dennis's fingerprints were on the camera equipment. His DNA was on the batteries. His face appeared in some recordings where he'd been checking camera angles. He'd documented his own crimes meticulously, never imagining he'd be caught. 8 months after Dennis's arrest, the trial began. It lasted 3 weeks with dozens of witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. Claire and I attended every day, sitting in the gallery watching justice slowly grind forward. We watched parents of other victims give tearful testimony about discovering their children had been violated. We watched a cybersecurity expert explain how Dennis had sold recordings to buyers in other countries, making thousands of dollars from his crimes. We watched Dennis's ex-girlfriend testify about finding cameras in her apartment and Dennis's manipulation when she'd confronted him. And we watched Dennis's attorney attempt to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that someone else with access to Dennis's apartment and computer could have committed these crimes, a theory that fell apart under cross-examination when prosecutors demonstrated that only Dennis had the knowledge and opportunity to install all the cameras in all the locations over the multi-year period involved. Sophia didn't testify in person because prosecutors and Dr. Okafor agreed it would be too traumatic. Instead, her testimony was recorded in a victim-friendly interview room with only the prosecutor, defense attorney, and judge present. The video was played for the jury, showing our 12-year-old daughter describing how she'd felt safe in her room, how the unicorn had been her favorite stuffed animal, how she'd sometimes change clothes in front of it without thinking because it was just a toy in her private space. Watching that video in the courtroom broke something in me that I don't think will ever fully heal. Sophia's voice was small and shaking, her face pale, her eyes darting to the camera nervously as she answered questions about what she'd felt when she learned about the surveillance. She said she felt dirty and exposed, and like she could never be alone again without wondering if someone was watching. She said she didn't understand why Uncle Dennis would hurt her this way. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Dennis showed no reaction as the verdicts were read, just sat motionless at the defense table while the judge polled the jury to confirm each member's vote. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. During that time, victims were invited to submit impact statements for the judge's consideration. Claire wrote one on Sophia's behalf, describing the nightmares and anxiety and therapy sessions and permanent loss of trust that Dennis had inflicted on our daughter. I wrote my own statement describing what it had been like to discover the camera, to realize someone we'd welcomed into our home had violated us in the most invasive way possible, to watch my daughter's childhood be stolen by someone who was supposed to protect her. 40 other families submitted statements telling similar stories of betrayal and trauma and shattered safety. The sentencing hearing was packed with victims and their families. The judge listened to hours of impact statements before addressing Dennis directly. She said she'd presided over many disturbing cases in her career, but that the calculated and systematic nature of Dennis's crimes represented some of the worst predatory behavior she'd encountered. He'd used familial trust and technical expertise to violate dozens of innocent people, including 16 children, over a period of years. He'd shown no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the harm he'd caused. The judge sentenced Dennis to 40 years in federal prison on the child exploitation charges, to be served consecutively with additional state sentences, totaling another 30 years for illegal surveillance and distribution of illegal recordings. Dennis would be 78 years old before he'd be eligible for parole. The judge also ordered him to pay restitution to all victims, though none of us expected to see any money. The sentence wasn't about financial recovery. It was about justice and ensuring Dennis could never hurt anyone again. Claire's parents didn't attend the trial or sentencing. They'd cut off contact completely after Dennis's conviction, unable to reconcile their image of their son with the reality of what he'd done. Claire grieved that loss separately from everything else, mourning the family relationships destroyed by her brother's crimes. She'd tried reaching out several times, sending letters and emails explaining that they could love Dennis while still acknowledging he'd done terrible things, but her parents never responded. Dr. Okafor said it wasn't uncommon for families to fracture this way, that accepting a loved one was capable of such harm required psychological work that some people couldn't or wouldn't do. The easier path was denial and blame, targeting the victims and witnesses rather than confronting the perpetrator. Maria eventually received a cooperation visa, allowing her to stay in the United States legally while the trial proceeded. After Dennis's conviction, prosecutors helped her apply for a victim visa, arguing that she'd been intimidated by a criminal in the course of his illegal activity. The application was approved, and Maria received permanent residency status. She sent me a letter through her attorney thanking me for supporting her visa application and apologizing again for not coming forward sooner. She explained that she'd been paralyzed by fear of deportation and separation from her young son, who was a U.S. citizen. The choice between protecting Sophia and protecting her own child had torn her apart for 2 weeks, until she'd found the compromise of leaving the note. I wrote back saying I understood, that she'd ultimately made the brave choice, and that her warning had protected Sophia from additional trauma. I meant it. My anger had been directed at Dennis, not at Maria, who'd been another victim of his manipulation. 2 years after finding Maria's note, life had achieved a new version of normal that would never quite match what we'd had before. Sophia was 14 and still in therapy, but functioning well. She'd rejoined soccer and maintained friendships, though she was more cautious about trusting adults and hyper-aware of her surroundings in ways that broke my heart. Her relationship with Claire's parents remained non-existent. They'd sent a birthday card for her 13th birthday with no return address and a generic message that didn't acknowledge what Dennis had done. Sophia had thrown it away without reading past the first line. Dr. Okafor said that boundary was healthy, that Sophia didn't owe forgiveness or relationship to people who'd chosen Dennis's comfort over her safety. Claire and I had processed our own trauma through couples therapy and individual counseling. The violation of our home had shaken our sense of security in ways that took years to rebuild. We'd moved to a new house in a different neighborhood, wanting a fresh start without the memories of Dennis's visits and the surveillance we'd lived under without knowing. We'd become active in advocacy organizations working to strengthen privacy laws and protect children from exploitation. Our testimony had been used in legislative hearings, considering new requirements for electronic device security and harsher penalties for hidden camera crimes. If Sophia's suffering could prevent other families from experiencing similar violation, that small redemption mattered. The civil lawsuit we'd filed against Dennis and the company where he'd worked as an IT specialist had settled for an undisclosed amount that would fund Sophia's therapy and education. The company had been found negligent for not monitoring Dennis's computer activity despite multiple policy violations that should have flagged his behavior earlier. They'd paid a substantial settlement to avoid public trial. That money couldn't undo what Dennis had done, but it ensured Sophia would have resources to heal and build the future he'd tried to steal from her. 3 years after Dennis's conviction, Sophia stood in front of a congressional committee testifying about her experience and advocating for stronger federal surveillance laws. She was 15, poised and articulate, no longer the terrified 12-year-old who'd learned her bedroom hadn't been private. She told lawmakers about the lasting impact of exploitation, about the importance of protecting children's privacy, and about why penalties for these crimes needed to match their severity. When she finished, several committee members thanked her for her courage and promised to support the legislation she'd endorsed. Watching my daughter transform her trauma into advocacy was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Dennis had tried to destroy her sense of safety and self. Instead, she'd become someone who fought to protect others from the same violation. That resilience was her victory over him, the proof that he hadn't broken what mattered most. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.